youths are going to be very beneficial in regards to climate change, in regards to they are living longer or whatever it is. But I think that it is still very lacking in terms of mechanizing the justification as to why it is okay to limit old people's political power, right? Simply by bringing simplistic characterization like biological or psychological about who's going to be impacted directly, about who's going to live longer. I think that this is a very simplistic justification. Like, what is even the parameter of impact being direct to begin with? They've never explained it all about it, and that is something that needs to be credited for closing government, right? One models in this debate. We think that we're going to impose normal voting with 100% calculation of vote until you are 50 years old, and we're going to decrease it by half every 10 years. For example, when you're 60 years old, your vote is going to be decreased to have calculability of 50%, and it's going to be decrease even in half when you're 70 years old to become quarter votes and whatnot, right? That is the models that closing government actually envision, right? Three arguments in this debate. First, in principle, why is it morally acceptable to decrease the weight age of an individual's vote as they age, right? This is directly clash with opposition's concern about equality and accessibility of political power. Two reasons. Firstly, like I said before, democracy is about generating the best output. It is not absolute rights, right? There needs to be certain qualification of you attaining political rights, right? One, when it is promising a potential better output, and secondly, when no one is being harmed in your political rights, right? The analogy as to why it is not absolute is, like I said before, convicted criminals, minors, or underage individuals are not allowed to vote, right? Their vote is unqualified because it has a big potential of harming people in general, right? That means participation is not absolute. But the question then becomes, why participation of equal voting for all people is going to be hamper democracy? For reasons. Firstly, because old people tend to nostalgize and romanticize the past, right? They believe that you are taught and glorified when you are young. The lesson that you're being taught when you are young usually becomes something that is very internalized even until you are old, for example, right? These individuals are literally individuals that live in President Reagan's era, for example, right, where there is so many sentiments about immigrants, right? Because immigrants make you jobless. They feed on the anxiety, saying that African American is bad, they are criminals, you should be racist or whatever it is, right? This internalization is something that happens on old people. And why then it is very bad? Because secondly, this internalization is also followed by a glorified sentiment that the older you are, the wiser you are, right? This means that these old people actually suffer from borderline God complex, right? They feel like they have already tasted every garam kehidupan or whatever it is, making them have this innate superiority complex, making them harder to compromise or self-evaluate their ideologies. Third reason, because these old people inherently currently have attained too much power, for example, right? This decrease all analysis about vulnerability that opening opposition wants to bring, right? These old people legitimately mostly already have sustainability and survivability, right? They're already hoarding money their entire lives, for example, right? They have political powers and whatnot. That is exactly why it is very unfair for their vote to have so much influence to vulnerable youths, right? That are starting in life, that are unable to access medical aid or insurance, or even policies about climate change, or even access to college and whatnot, right? But fourth reason, there is a narrative that they are always the biggest contributors for the state building, right? Exactly like what opening opposition said, there is a normalization and glorification narrative of old people saying that I am the one that built this country, right? I'm the one that this country needs to be indebted into. So it is okay for me to be racist. It is okay for me to be anti-immigrant. Exactly because I am the one that makes you exist to begin with, making it even harder for them to evaluate or correct their ideologies to begin with, right? But second analysis, right? Why then tampering or intervening political power or voting is justifiable? We say that in Senate or even House of Representatives or even presidential election, states like Virginia or Georgia or Maine has considerably lesser vote weight age if we compare it to bigger states like California or Texas or New York, right? This doesn't mean that democracy is unfair. Because again, it is measured on the best output, right? This is measured on the possibility of generating the best outcome, right? People living in urban areas is considerably, for example, or more expected to be more modernized, expected to have more holistic political exposure and knowledge, thus making it easier or making it justified for them to have bigger political weight age rather than people living in Georgia or Virginia, for example. Again, doesn't mean that democracy is shitty, for example. It doesn't mean that it is unfair, but merely talking about generating the best outputs. But second arguments in regards to urgency, right? This is going to literally kick out opening opposition in this debate. Firstly, opening opposition say that minority and youth will still have platform. That is why it is not urgent for us to limit boomers' political power, we said that this is not likely going to be the case because the huge power and bargaining index that old people have inside political structure is the inherent reason that triggers political apathetic in youths, right? That is exactly why right now we see less discourse about less discourse about youth not wanting sending troops in warfare, less urgency and awareness about environmental issues in youth, exactly because they feel outnumbered, they feel misheard. No matter how many votes that they give to good politicians like Sanders for universal basic income or for Andrew Yang for his grand policies, they're always going to be numbered. And the politicians that are going to be voted is always those who are pro-corporation and pro-war, for example, right? So OO cannot run away by saying that this platform exists, but also needs to prove why it is still effective. But secondly, OO also brings that youths also have irrationality, right? They join Indonesia Nikah Muda, they also easily sway too. This is not going to be likely. Two reasons. First of all, because we say that youths, no matter how irrational they are still on the stage of life where they are being exposed to so many identities. Exactly like what OO said, there is a complexity of choosing your political identities, right? Exactly because you're being exposed so much. They have wider and bigger calculation as to which political ideas that they want to opt to and not going to be as stubborn as boomers, for example, right? But secondly, we say that youths, exactly because they're always used to scapegoat or blamed by the oldies, for all of the shitty things that happens in this world, that is exactly why they have bigger tendency to be super careful in choosing their political identities. This is also answering the POI coming from closing opposition. This is why 17 years old will make a better and more rational political decision 70 years old, right? We said that under all of the metrics of democracy, be it as participation, be it as accountability, or even choosing the best representation, all of this power should inherently and absolutely be given more to the youths rather than to the old, not necessarily for biological or psychological reasons, but rather because they deserve it to begin with, right? Very proud to propose.
Thank you very much, member of GAF. Next speaker, member of OP.
Sabar ya, udah tua.
Maaf. Anak-anak muda sekarang debatnya bagus-bagus sekali. Okay. My name is Mario. I have no preferred gender pronouns. And for POI, feel free to unmute yourself and state if you are OG or CG. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, if you want to make a policy as a state or as a member of parliament, you need to ensure how, and you need to prove how likely your characterization is going to be. That means the burden of the opening government and also closing government is to prove why older generations or older demographic are most likely going to make a bad decision in the first place, and secondly, why it is likely that they will not listen or accommodate the interests of the young people. And that is exactly why opening government and closing government fail in this debate. There are several things I'm going to talk about in my speech today. Firstly, I'm going to talk about, is there anything such as bad choice in democracy? And secondly, I'm going to talk about how democracy would look like under government's proposal of decreasing the weightage of older demographics vote. But before that, let me start with one minor issues that are being proposed by the closing government. They brought several issues. Firstly, nostalgia. Let's ask a simple question. Is nostalgia really that bad? Because the closing government really tried to prove that, look, the older demography are trying to romanticize their past, and information coming from the generations are completely irrelevant. We beg to differ, panel, because information from the past generations, especially older demography, we can draw the parallel to modern issues. Issues such as economic crisis, wars, and tensions among states are not new issues. There are issues that have existed for so many generations, and the solutions are oftentimes relying on information that we can retrieve from the past generation and older demography. So they failed to prove why nostalgia and romanticization of the past really that matters in affecting how older generation vote. And secondly, more importantly, they try to prove that there's an imbalance of influence of older generations. So that's why the issues of youth, young generations would automatically be decreased. In order for this argument to work, they need to prove why you can generalize all people are likely to hoard all influences and resources. We'll argue that the presence of older demography should be embraced by youth because they add legitimacy of youth-specific issues. Exactly because of politicians like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, issues like student loans gain attention, and issues like environmental activism gains attention. Not only because it adds the volume of campaign by youth people are also big, but it adds the presence of Bernie and Elizabeth Warren adds legitimacy to the issue. Like, look, this is something that is important to be talked about because it's not all talking about our generation, but the future generation as well. And secondly, the presence of older politicians and older demography who supports the quote youth issues becomes a bridge of explanation to older demography. Exactly because of the relatability to other older demography, these issues are gaining attention. We admit that right now the status quo is not perfect. That issues like student loans and environmental issues are still debatable inside the parliament. But one, it's slowly improving compared to back then of previous generations. And secondly, the divisions of these issues are not mainly caused by older demography. There are divisions of polarizations of the issue also exist inside even the young generations. So the closing of government failed to prove all these 2 points. Let's not talk about them in this debate. Now, onto my first main issue. Is there anything such as bad choice in democracy? Most of government teams say yes because it depends on one's cognitive ability as the age and also one's background. It's a bit of deadlock in opening debate, including closing government, because no one can explain if there's any possibility of making bad choices, or is there anything such as bad choices in democracy. We say no. There's no such thing as bad choice in democratic system. One, because one's quality of choice is affected by various factors that they themselves cannot control. It depends on how informed you are, how aware you are on the current issues. It has nothing to do with age because access of information also affects this factor. Now, not everyone has the same access to news, to media, irrespective of their age. It depends on various multi-layers of issues. That means irrespective of your age, it is completely uncontrollable. We have different approach from this point from opening opposition, who try to prove older demography is still relevant, but we will prove why there's no such thing as poor choices in democracy. B, because there's a presence of political dynamics, which issues are deemed the most priority for the nation. Government is unclear on what kind of issues that will most likely will be harmed if we allow older demography to vote. If the issues is as urgent as pandemic or impending threat of global warming, most likely everyone will take this into account when voting, irrespective of their age. Now, exactly, we have a lot of older demography, which I've explained before, who are not aware of this issue. C, quality of your vote depends on how mature your nation democracy is. If the democracy is as immature as Indonesia, with a lot of identity politics, black campaign, no matter how old you are, most people will likely make bad choices because the process of democracy is bad. D, or even physiological factors. You cannot generalize all older generations are bad or have bad brains. It depends on their each lifestyle. And B, if older demographies have bad physiological feature, it's not their fault either. The conclusion is there's no such thing as poor or bad choices in election. Even if there is one, it's not the failure of the older generation. It's the systemic failure of the demographic system in their country and the systemic failure of the government, that particular country that fails to proliferate information and educate the people, be it them young or old. Secondly, what is the principle that we're trying to prove? One's suffrage or even the weightage of one's vote should not be decreased based on things that you cannot control, such as your race, geographical locations, educational background, including age. No one has the ability to prevent aging. It is unfortunately an unfortunate consequences of being alive. Furthermore, older demographies have existed in our country for so long. It is different from other things that cause removal of your suffrage, directly engaging to closing government. Like member of armed forces and non-citizen, A, it's still debatable. B, because you voluntarily give up your voting privilege. Or C, including minors and most people who are mentally not able, because you cannot make decisions on your own, that you need to be put under guardianship. So that means there's such thing as bad choices. This is different from the removal of one suffrage that exists in status quo right now. Now, talk about second issues. How democracy would look like in government's proposal. Assuming the best out of government's case, what it entails is further polarization of political environment. In order for older older generation in their world to be accommodated, they need to build a collective voting bloc to make sure that their interests are accommodated. That means there's going to be no room for compromise to further polarize between the youth and the older generation. And assuming the youth will take charge of their political situation, if the outcome is bad, that means there's going to be blame game towards the youth people that will be put. Look, you are not working. So let's put emphasis on importance of elections, especially general election. Election is the one avenue that policymakers are able to collect society's aspiration to determine the political ideologies to solve the most important issues in the nation. So that means we cannot afford to have even more polarization based on age. We are more than proud to oppose this motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, member of UP. Next speaker, Gafwit.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Just a second. Options or bad informations, I think they neglect the fact what is the motivating factors of that decisions, right? Because when surveys like trying to deduce why is the reasons as to all people like get to determine the decisions of Brexit, for instance, and what is the motivating factors as to why that happens. A lot of all people says that we need to have Brexit because we need to prevent immigrants to enter the countries, right? It's not a decisions about economics. It's not a decisions about having sovereignty and democracy, but rather about decisions about hating people from that looks different from you. I'll talk about two things. Number one, I'll talk about the principle, why tempering the voting power of all people is justified. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the result, why it would create better democracy and healthier ones. So firstly, what the principle, why is it actually justified? Because the point that my members trying to bring is that democracy is always about generating the best output. It's not about representations of everyone's. It's about representation as long as it generates the best outcome and not harming individuals. And there are several reasons that my member brings that receive poor engagement from the other side about what is the reasons that all people participation is actually bad. We're talking about nostalgia, and the reason the response that we heard is that nostalgia is important so that we can learn from the past about policy. Like, we are not erasing history. Obviously, we can learn about things that like policy that works in the past. For instance, the problems with nostalgia is that when you romanticize the past, you dilute the rationality for you to have new informations that come in, which means that you're more likely going to only resort into the past. Which means that under government world, for instance, like we can still learn about what is the best policy to generate the good outcome in the present. But the problem is that the policy that works in the past doesn't necessarily works in the present, right? And this is the reasons why we need to ensure that nostalgia doesn't exist. And this can only happen when young people participation swap matters, because all people participations only dilute the rationality of these democracies. And the important things that they talk about is that, and I'm going to engage to their side about to closing opposition as to why all people participation is better, right? Because we told you several things. We told you about nostalgia. We told you about their internalizations of norms that they are wiser, that not only influence the way all people think about themselves, but the way young people think about all peoples. This is the reasons why young people are very, very afraid of all peoples, right? Are very afraid to engage about bad idea for them that who are racist and sexist, for instance. But there are norms, for instance, that say that they have so much powers and that contributed so much to those countries. These reasons prompted them to do not want to compromise about the values that young people trying to bring. And these reasons why when young people trying to have relaxing policy about immigration, for instance, like relaxing policy about abortion, for instance, all people says that no, this is something that is bad, it harms the value. Believe me, I'm the one who should know about this. And this is the reasons why I think like all people do not want to actually compromise at all about the value and policy that young people trying to advocate for. And this is the reasons why it's principally justified for us to actually decreasing the powers of the voting powers of the all peoples, right? when closing opposition says that there is no such thing as bad choice, like obviously a choice that prevent women to decide what to do with their body is a bad choice. Obviously, a policy that prevent trans people to have like trans surgery and hormone therapy is a bad choice. You cannot tell me that this is actually subjective policy. We think that this is objectively saying something that is actually good. And the way that voting powers and the way that policy and powers that concentrated among the old people means that they actually able to prevent all of these things to actually happenings. We think that it's principally justified for us to actually limit and inhibit this. And the reason as to why young people betters, obviously young people are, some of them are stupid. I mean, like, I'm not going to generalize, but the reason as to why young people is better and open to new idea and better at compromising value is because they are exactly young. They need to fight. They are still in the phase of trying to find new identity. They are still in the phase of trying to understand the opposing value and the value that perhaps other people have, for instance. And this is the reasons why it's easier for them to compromise, to open to new idea. And this is the reason why in the status quo, a lot of young people are very liberal, for instance. Even you can see it like objectively in our country, yeah. And this is the reasons why it's good closing opposition.
Yep, because you cannot generalize all young people are open to that, are going to be open to that new ideas. Why can't you also generalize that all older generations would not have incentive to learn about something new inside that happens to young people?
Yeah, we give you structural reasons, but no nostalgia, internalization of norm that they are wiser, internalization norm that they are actually contributing so much to the country, and the fact that they usually hoard wealth and the most invulnerable people in this country. This is the structural reason you need to engage to this. Okay. Secondly, about creating better democracy. Now, the impact is two. Number one, we dilute the power of the old people, but number two, we create signaling effect to signal the young that, hey, you are matter in this democracy, yeah? Because in the status quo, young people feel that they are powerless. They feel that they do not have any power within democracy exactly because they are always powerless in comparison to the old peoples, right? And this is the reason why on our side of Dallas, we get able to signal the young people that say that you need to participate more in this country because your voice is matter. And it's not only about signaling effect, it's also a signaling effect to the young people. It's also signaling effect to the politicians and to the internal party systems to say that you need to include all young people, and you need to most likely that exactly because I already announced that they are more open to new interpretation and new idea. Most likely that the policy outcome of that is, for example, like things about environmental issue, for instance, and things like accessible abortions and healthcare for trans people, for instance. Exactly because this is the norms. Exactly because these norms that most appealing to the young peoples. But let's take a look about engaging to the worst case scenario that all people is vulnerable and poor and all of that things. Notice that the policy of pension, healthcare fund for all people is not antithetical with the policy of giving accessible healthcare for trans people. Like those things could happen in the same times. And most likely, young people will also vote for policy that is important for all people because they will get old someday. Yeah, of course, they will still try to have to vote for policy that accessible for like ensuring that all people will be taken care of because they will get old someday. This is not antithetical. It's not contradictory. Those things will happen at the same time under government world. But it's better because we can ensure that young people is more open to interpretations. I ran out of time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Gafwip. Next speaker, Hopwip.
Just checking if I'm audible.
Yes.
All right. Okay, POI through chat, or you can just unmute your. No, don't unmute yourself. Just turn on your camera and wave so I can see that you are about to interrupt me. So I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. This motion basically says that one of the judges, in this case Jane, does not matter in the debate because her concerns and her voting power would be lesser compared to other judges because Jane has aged more than the other judges. The same way applies to closing opposition because we are the oldest in the room does not mean that our concerns value less, because that's the motion That's what the motion will do. It's beyond old people's concerns value less, but it transcends into the policies being discussed and the eroding political climate that we will have as well. So leave OG and somewhat CG as well out of the debate because they mainly talk about things such as number one, regarding declining ability for you to comprehend information due to the declining physical health or things like that. Well, it might be true, but it doesn't mean that the young are inherently and automatically smarter as well, because one's ability to grasp information differs from one another, and this has been explained by my member, which the government will conveniently disregarded. But on our side, that's exactly the reason that why politicians engage with all layers of society through different campaign methods. On their side, politicians don't even want to engage, and what they will focus on is how then to, let's say, please the youth. But another question arises then. The youth do not necessarily have this omniscient perspective as well, to the point that they can think of everything. In the current political climate, old people, regardless of which parties they belong to, are considered as part of the constituents. So young people have active incentive to discuss with them or to ask what would be their concerns, so they work together and they mediate. Comparatively, I think my member also already explained that in order for old people, now that this motion passes, they will have to create a voting block. In this case, that they are going to create a system in which they are going to demonize young people if they're unable to pass on their policies, which in the end will only polarize the people even more. And we think that even though, let's say, their number might be lesser or fewer, but regardless, there are people with concerns, and therefore they have the ability and they should have the right to do that. On their side, youths will not have the incentive to engage with the aging population because they think that the old people do not matter, and it immediately affects the policies being discussed, policies that typically youth forgets or they cannot comprehend today because they're too focused in the now. Their second concern then is biases, nostalgia, or whatnot, which strangely also affects young people because biases do not discriminate. Young people today are also hard-headed due to the overflowing information they can receive from various platforms. People will believe what they want to believe regardless. So in the end, this principle from both OG and CG does not stand. So also leave CG because they seem to forget basic BP rules, because you're not allowed to bring a new model, but then the model that they brought does not necessarily change anything anyway. So let me respond to their case when the way they respond to Romario's case would be by saying, oh, we gave you structural reasons. CG, structural reasons need to be strong to be used as a response to that speech and POI. So let me tell you why those reasons do not even have solid structures and foundations to begin with. First, let's respond to the idea about, when they brought about Brexit or whatnot. I thank CG for bringing up about Brexit and put the blame on old people. So dismissing entirely what my member said, that it's a structural failure of a democratic system, in this case, the UK's democratic system. First response to this, siapa suruh, you did it through one fucking referendum without proper education of the people. What does it entail if you're going to choose yes or no? If anything, it's Boris fucking Johnson's fault alone. But this blame game is exactly the danger that closing opposition would want to avoid. Notice that from closing government, they would want to blame all of the failure to the old people. And we say it's dangerous because the blame game is something that we cannot afford in a democracy, because in the end, you will blanketly think that just because old people failed us because of Brexit, then their voting power or their concerns do not matter. So there will be an active interest not to care or not to cater the issues that old people care about, such as pension. The way CG responds is by saying, no, they will be old regardless. True, but in the end, what they focus on right now is not pension, because it's still way long to go. They're going to talk about climate change, and the way they engage with old people, shut up, old people, you are immaterial, you are not important, so we do not care about you. And that would be exactly the political climate that will happen on their side. They will also change the calculus of even politicians engaging with their people. So of course, it's antithetical. So that's why we are not going to let CG win. Then they talk about nostalgia, whatever, and whatnot. This argument completely ignores the existence of overtone window, which is a possibility that your political leaning can change from one time to another. In the past, for example, imperialism or war is very popular. But now even the old people do not like the idea of sending our military troops or being involved in another war, right? But even if, let's say, these things are still important, to the very least on our side, they have the incentives to engage with the young people. Hey, the reason that why I'm still concerned about this issue is because of this. Instead of demonizing one another, that in the end will also make the politicians become even more demonized. So that's why that we think closing opposition wins. But regardless, let's talk about the issue that they conveniently forgot when we are talking about how democracies cannot exclude people based on the things that they cannot control. This is an important principle that other teams seem to just dismiss. Because the reason that why, let's say there are some things that we can legally limit, we don't exclude people based on the things that cannot control, where they're from, their race, this includes their age. Because not only that age is uncontrollable, but it's also imminent and unavoidable. Decreasing their voting weight age means that the state is actively excluding people for things they have zero control of. So principally speaking, this is already a failure to begin with. And exactly because they have zero control on the matter, it comes back to the point when my member already beautifully explained that there are no poor choices of democracy, especially if you attribute it to certain individual. Even if we are going to say that there are certain bad choices in democracies, it's because of the system that is failing. If you want to talk about, let's say, how our country are being like this and like that, the fact that we are immature democracy, it doesn't change anything if you're going to give more vote towards the young people anyway, because in the end, the democratic system is immature. So it doesn't really solve anything. So that's why their problems are mismatched, right? But most importantly, let's talk about the political climate that will happen on their side that I have also addressed a bit in my previous points. Because all of their reasoning are saying that, you know, that people are not going to change because they're old or things like that. But in the end, young people can also be very hard-headed. Young people can also be, they can still be stuck on certain belief as well. But on our side, to the very least, like my member said, we have existing bridges of old people who are trying to engage with the youth. People like Bernie Sanders, who are popular even among the youths, not among the old people. So on your side, you will demolish the existing bridge of the active incentive to engage with one another. And you change the way politicians engage as well. And the harms about polarizing the people, putting a blame game that India, making the democracy becoming even more eroded, is something that you cannot ignore in the debate. On our side, we ensure a better cooperation is better sustained. Youths have active interest to engage, and old people are more engaged as well. And that's why we think that it's better for democracy, so vote for closing opposition.
Thank you very much, everyone. All of you may leave the room. Silent round this is, and you will hear the announcement in the main hall. Thank you very much. Judges, just stay here. Yeah.